I read an online article called The Early Church Fathers on Jesus by Dr. Mike Licona, who's a Baptist scholar, historian, and apologist. He wrote it against the Watchtower teaching of a, quote, created pre-human Jesus. Dr. Licona accuses the JWs of, quote, misleading its own followers and readers by misquoting the so-called church fathers in support of the JW teaching about Jesus. So in response, Dr. Licona quotes early so-called church fathers like Hippolytus was one of the most important figures from the 2nd to 3rd century after Christ. He wrote, "Let us believe then, dear brethren, according to the tradition of the apostles, that God the Word came down from heaven and entered into the Holy Virgin Mary, in order that, taking the flesh from her, and assuming also a human, was manifested as God in a body, coming forth too as a perfect man, for it was not in mere appearance or by conversion, but in truth that he became man." The noted Anglican Bishop Richard Hansen described this type of doctrine as a, quote, spacesuit Christology. Just as the astronaut, in order to operate in a part of the universe where there's no air, where he has to experience weightlessness, puts on an elaborate spacesuit which enables him to live and act in this new, unfamiliar environment, so the Logos put on a body which enabled him to behave as a human being among human beings. But his relation to this body is no closer than that of an astronaut to his spacesuit. Now, while Trinitarians and some non-Trinitarians like the Jehovah's Witnesses fundamentally disagree on whether or not Jesus was created, both views nonetheless vehemently teach a so-called, quote, pre-human Jesus. But is this really what the New Testament actually says? Matthew 1, verses 1 and 18 describe, quote, the record of the origin of Jesus and how this, quote, origin came about. That is, when God begat or procreated his son in the womb of Mary, and that's according to Matthew 1, verse 20. It's crucial to note that Matthew uses the Greek word genesis with one N, which means origin, as opposed to genesis with two N's, which in Greek simply means a birth. So Matthew is describing not just that Jesus was born, that Mary gave birth, but that the Son of God, Jesus, came into existence. And that's why Matthew calls it the origin. Now, the public is not helped by most translations that do not properly render the Greek text at this point. One of the first ever Bibles I was given was Today's New International Version. So this version you're looking at is a 2001 Today's New International Version. Now, I grew up as an agnostic, as some of you know. I had no, quote, church baggage. I had other baggage, agnosticism. But when I looked into these matters as a new Christian, I happened to have this Bible. And when I found out this information about how sometimes in the copies of the New Testament, the manuscripts that we have no originals, right? We have copies of copies of copies. But there are people that devote their lives to studying these manuscripts, and they find sometimes what they call corruptions of the text, and this is one of them. So notice there in verse 1, Today's New International Version, in the main body of the translation as it's called, renders Genesis with one N as genealogy. And then in verse 18 they have it as birth. But in reality, as you can see there, so they have footnotes on both verses. This is the account of the origin of Jesus the Messiah. I happen to have this translation, which is rare. This translation has not been reprinted as far as I know, and if it has, not in this way. In other words, not with the footnote that you see there. So the origin of Jesus the Messiah was like this, verse 18, as you see there. That was mind-blowing, stunned mullet. It was amazing. I thought, what is going on here? So clearly, for Matthew, the Son of God, who is Jesus, one and the same person, originated in the womb of his mother Mary. Now, obviously, this happens, I say happens flippantly, but this happens to coincide with Luke's account. So in Luke 1:35, we see the description of this very same miracle, and this time by the words of the angel of the Lord, no less, to the Virgin Mary. And the angel says, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. For that reason," that's why, "he who shall be begotten in you shall be holy and will be called the Son of God." You could even argue that the virgin birth is alluded to by John in his gospel and in his letters when he says, for example, in 1 John 5:18, "The one begotten by God protects the believer." And of course, John's repeated reference to Jesus as the only begotten Son. The Greek there is monogenes ios, using the modern Greek pronunciation. Now, I give you the Greek there not just to be flashy, but because this is an important point. These Greek words, like monogenes, genesis, are related to another very important Greek word, genao, which means, if you search any standard lexicon, to generate, produce, or simply to procreate. Hence, this is why we should dispense with the old, antiquated King James word of begotten and adopt a word like, or my preference, my personal preference, of procreation language, because that's what the words mean. Now, even though in English the dictionary meaning of the word beget still means, according to the Merriam-Webster's dictionary that you see there, quote, "to cause something to come into existence primarily through procreation." Even the word beget or begotten means that. So it's clear. The New Testament teaches that the human Son originated inside, not outside, the womb of the Virgin Mary. My point is that to believe in a pre-existent Jesus is just as bad as believing in a, quote, created pre-human Jesus. For a Jesus who is said to have noiselessly and gently entered into the Virgin's womb, that's a quote from one of these so-called church fathers, John Chrysostom, or that Mary received into her virginal and fragrant bridal chamber Jesus, and that's a guy called Saint Theodosius, is simply to believe in another Jesus, as Paul warns. The noted German historian Adolf Harnack rightly asked if this type of doctrine was, quote, another remnant of the old Gnostic leaven. He said, "We must describe this doctrine as the strenuous effort of Stoic Platonism to obtain a supremacy in the theology of the church, a displacement of the historical Jesus by the pre-existent Christ, of the Christ of reality by the Christ of the church fathers' thought, their fantasy." He said, when the Logos Christology of this pre-existent Jesus obtained a complete victory, the traditional view of the supreme deity, God, as one person, and along with this, every thought of the real and complete human personality of Jesus was in fact condemned as being intolerable in the church. Its place was taken by, quote, the nature of Christ, which without the person of Christ, that is the Son of God, is simply a cipher. In other words, you have a complete zero, a nothing Jesus.